In a previous entry of the 10,000, I mentioned that China faces a series of major economic and political risks. Paramount leader Xi Jinping has warned Communist Party leaders about the dangers of mental slackness, professional inadequacy, and the separation of the masses. With the move to eliminate the sovereignty of Hong Kong, Xi Jinping is now worried more about the volatility of the masses. The die has been cast. The annexation of Hong Kong will most likely be the greatest political risk in the 21st century, as the European mobilization was after the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand in the 20th century. What China may face at the end of this political risk is a complete closing of the Chinese economy, the society, and the largest economic collapse in decades. In previous entries, I have discussed why this collapse will happen by introducing China's debt crisis and the primal economic forces tearing at Chinese society. For the last few months, journalism on China has been marred with ignorance on basic economic truths and a complete lack of understanding in Chinese history. The mission of the 10,000 is to shine light onto the shadows of the cave wall. In this entry, I will be doing that by providing a three-part process to describe the steps I take in this analysis for the real geopolitical risk in China and what the party wants to accomplish. As Will Durant would say, it is impossible to summarize over 3,000 years of Chinese history in 15 minutes. Yet, we proceed. This is the 10,000. If you enjoy the content, like and subscribe to help the channel. Hong Kong has always been a place that kept Chinese rulers up at night. The first part of the equation is that China is divisive. Since the unification of China by the first emperor Shi Huangdi in 221 BC, the 3.5 millennia-old civilization of China has only been unified under central control for about 300 years in total. Most of those 300 years have witnessed the authoritarian regimes of the Chinese Communist Party and the Mongol Yuan dynasty. The first authoritarian Chinese regime was under the Grand Unifier of China himself, Qin Shi Huang. The first emperor only ruled for a decade until power was handed to his son, and the empire collapsed from the simultaneous rebellions in multiple regions. Areas that throughout Chinese history have been a problem for consecutive dynasties. One of the multiple rebellious regions that constantly gave the capital a problem was the southern part of China, which contains today's defiant city of Hong Kong. During the time of the Qin dynasty unification, southern China was ruled not by the ethnic Han people, the people group that is considered the true ethnic Chinese, but by the Yue people, or Bai Yue, meaning the 100 Yue, or the 100 Yue tribes. The Yue people lived along the southern coast of China, the Pearl River Valley, and northern Vietnam. The Yue people were brought into China when the Qin Emperor conquered some of the Yue tribes that lived on the mouth of the Pearl River, modern-day Guangzhou, Shenzhen, and Hong Kong. When the Qin Empire dissolved, the Yue tribes on the Pearl River rebelled and built their own empire called Nan Yue, meaning the Southern Yue, and conquered the Pearl River system in the northern half of modern-day Vietnam. The state of Nan Yue was more or less fully independent for a century. Meanwhile, in 202 BC, the northern Chinese states finished their infighting and consolidated under the more divided and less centralized Han dynasty. The Han, having to deal with imperial politics and nomadic invasions, had no real appetite or strength to conquer the Yue. It wasn't until a century later that the Han were able to subjugate the state of Nan Yue, but even in the Han dynasty, the southern capital played a role independent from the core, providing a place for commerce and international trade in times of peace and refuge in times of civil war in the north. Throughout Chinese history, the Yue identity disappeared. New people groups formed and lived in the Pearl River Valley. Sometimes they were independent, sometimes they were subjugated by the Chinese capital, oftentimes they lived how they wanted. The most familiar group of people who live there are the people who live there today, Cantonese people who speak the Cantonese language. They too have been caught up in the dynastic and economic cycles of Chinese history. For instance, during the late Qing era, an era of division, the cities in the Canton region flourished with material wealth. The British treaty port cities on the Pearl River grew extremely wealthy and attracted migrant workers from rural China. It became so wealthy, in fact, that during the Boxer Rebellion, the governor of Canton, Li Hongzhang, refused to aid the Chinese empress in fight against the European merchant powers. At the time, Canton gained significantly from a disunited China, as it has throughout most of its history. Since China is now mostly unified, the Cantonese on the Pearl River Valley have a somewhat weak identity. but is incredibly strong in one city, the city of Hong Kong, the core focus of the century and of Chinese politics for the last year. Today's culture of resistance to central authority in Hong Kong, their insistence of the use of the Cantonese language, and the love for the English common law system is the modern expression of millennia of history on the Pearl River Valley. Now that is the history. What is happening today? China's economy is terminally sick. The second part of the equation is the economic catastrophe and the catalyst for change that it brings. Hong Kong is one of the world's greatest financial centers and the most important for China. When Hong Kong was first handed over to China in 1997, it equaled almost 20% of China's GDP. But GDP was never the biggest impact Hong Kong had on China. It was capital, money. Even after 40 years of opening, China still has massive capital controls and significantly intervenes in the economy, making it a shaky bet for investors or in most cases unavailable. Hong Kong, on the other hand, because of China's one country, two systems policy, has one of the most liberal financial sectors on earth and is one of the biggest markets for equity and debt. Therefore, no city in China can replace Hong Kong. Not Shenzhen, not Beijing, not even Shanghai. Because of its special status, Hong Kong has been the way that money flowed in and out of China. Chinese corporations used Hong Kong as a way to obtain capital from the outside world, and foreign corporations used Hong Kong as a launchboard into China. With the annexation of Hong Kong completely into China, this capital market will be effectively gone. China will not be able to maintain foreign money anymore to fuel its economy. As we have discussed in the 10,000s entry on China's debt crisis, China is facing a financial crisis due to the massive overextension of credit throughout the last 2 decades, almost 6 times from the financial crisis to 2019. Private and corporate debt skyrocketed in China, and the total debt is now over 300% of GDP. If the virus doesn't collapse the Chinese system entirely, it would add enormously to this debt. In Q1 of 2020, China's economic problems have been a collapse of the supply side, with the economy contracting by about 6.8%. But the economic malaise will not stop there. China has an export-led economy, and since there is no demand for their products in developed countries, as it stands right now, Q2 will see a demand-side collapse. For a more detailed analysis, watch the previous entry. With the blocking of foreign investment into Hong Kong, China loses the major option it has in order to put money into its economic system. Xi Jinping has stalled on actually implementing force, but as time goes on, he will probably be forced to annex the city in reality. The total implementation of force on Hong Kong will admit that there is going to be an economic depression in China, permanently destroying its capital structure. China's economic system cannot stand this, but neither can its political system. Since the end of the Mao era, China's political system has not been based on any kind of political rights or privileges or a communist ideal, but on the mandate of continued economic growth. Since this economic growth is impossible, this looming catastrophe will create a domino effect, collapsing the economic and then the political apparatuses. The Chinese Communist Party knows this, and they've been preparing for this crisis and a new mandate. The Central Committee has a choice: be united with power or be divided with no power. The third part of the equation is agency. When it comes to human rights abuses, the Chinese Communist Party is not renowned for its subtlety. Repression of Tibetan, Uyghur, and Mongolian separatists have been documented for decades and have been increased readily within the last 7 years. It is even impossible for an outsider to visit Tibet without being paraded around Potemkin villages by a government-sponsored tour group, making journalism on the subject close to impossible, because the ruling establishment cannot tolerate much dissent. The Chinese Communist Party is so intolerant of dissent that it doesn't even let the Catholic Church name its own Chinese bishops, destroying a millennium of Catholic tradition. This is because the party has one policy above the rest: control. Control has been the modus operandi for the Chinese Communist Party. The CCP controls rebellious minority groups. They control dissent for the masses. They control religious thought. They try to control the foreign policy of other nations, and because they are actually still a state-run system, they control China's economy, even to its detriment. In fact, when the Chinese Communist Party acts irrationally, its error is usually on the side of control instead of the side of openness. The main agency of the Chinese Communist Party is control. and this will be the way in which they will answer the next pressing question in Chinese history. So China is a country that is today straddling both being divided and open. The looming economic crisis is an agent of change that will force China out of the status quo. The ruling establishment, the Chinese Communist Party, has favored control as a method in dealing with problems. From Tiananmen to the Uyghur internment camps to the bishops in the Catholic Church. So in order to face the next stage in Chinese history, the 10,000 predicts the CCP will force China shut. For much of its history, China has been a country that teetered between openness and isolationism. The openness led to wealth, but also to division, and the isolationism led to unification, but also to poverty. In another entry of the 10,000, we discussed the economic and political divisions in China between its rural core and its urban centers of wealth. In that entry, we mentioned the late Qing dynasty, an era of division and wealth. Since the central authority in Beijing was weak, there came several different powers intervening in Beijing's affairs, all trying to divide up the spoils of China. First the United Kingdom, then France, the United States, Austria-Hungary, Germany, and Japan, among others. Trade with these nations brought wealth to the urban centers in China that were next to navigable waterways, the coasts in the east and south, and along the Yangtze River. Cities like Hong Kong, Wuhan, and Shanghai flourished and caused a massive wealth divide between the urbanites and the rural farmers. Consequently, numerous rebellions started in the interior provinces that aimed to undo this trend of openness and inequality, or erupted because of it. Among these revolutions were the unsuccessful Taiping Rebellion, Boxer Rebellion, Nian Rebellion, and the Hui people, or Muslim rebellions. In the previous entry, we focused on Mao Zedong's rebellion, the rebellion that finally closed China and destroyed its division. Today, we will be focusing on another rebellion, one that was unsuccessful, one that was like Mao's rebellion but had a different cultural flavor. A rebellion that, although older, is more relevant today than the Republican Xinhai Revolution or Mao's Communist Revolution. It was the Boxer Rebellion. The Boxer Rebellion, or the Yihetuan movement, was a movement that started in northeastern China on the interior section of the Shandong province. It was a nationalistic movement that tried to drive foreigners and their influences out of China. Believing themselves to be immortal, the Boxers armed themselves with guns and swords and proclaimed supernatural invulnerability from cannons, bullets, and knives. Declaring a holy war, the Boxers asserted that millions of soldiers would descend out of Tian, heaven, to assist them in purifying China of foreign oppression. They attacked merchants, churches, Christians, and any vestiges of the foreign. The late Qing dynasty, realizing the Boxers can be used against their enemies, exploited the Boxers as an agent to reassert control of their crumbled empire. They were succeeding until the imperial powers that controlled bits of China sent reinforcements on behest of their imperial capitals. An eight-nation alliance of industrialized countries reasserted their claims over China and, because of their industrialized militaries, crushed the Boxer Rebellion. Today there is another Boxer Rebellion, but it's not on the streets burning Christian churches or foreign trade infrastructure. But it's online. In November of 2019, China's state-run media site Xinhuanet posted a piece on the Boxer Rebellion. What was interesting about the piece is not that it glossed over some of the more reprehensible parts of the history to create a national story. Many articles do that always and everywhere, but that it actively glorified the more reprehensible parts. According to a Chinese Catholic news site, the author described the large-scale persecutions of Christians as an anti-imperialistic patriotic movement and elevated the torture and slaughter of one's countrymen to untouchable levels of patriotic fever. It is a message that the heavily censored and curated state internet wants to promote and has been for some time. Most social movements on the Chinese web are promptly put down, even ones that would not necessarily hurt the CCP narrative, like the Me Too movement, simply because the party cannot control them. For the last turbulent months, there is one narrative that is allowed to exist, and it exists brazenly: a new Boxer Rebellion. Since April, an online movement took over Chinese social media. It is called the Yihetuan movement. Like the older Boxer Rebellion at the turn of the century, the social movement triggered anti-foreign rhetoric. Propelled by the virus, foreigners have seen dramatic rise in xenophobia across China. Foreigners have been banned from entering the country, and the state has wrongfully blamed them for all spikes in virus cases. Certain ethnic groups, particularly Africans, have been forced and corralled away and put in isolation, even if they have been in China throughout the pandemic. Non-Chinese people have been banned from stores and restaurants. However, these instances of xenophobia, although bad, are not the sole focus of the government's ire. What is the main target of these attacks is not just foreigners living in China, but foreign governments. According to the Nikkei Asian Review, many Chinese have commented about a modern-day eight-nation alliance that is unrightfully blaming China for all the world's ills, and that there is a conspiracy to demand compensation from China. Throughout this online Boxer Rebellion, the upper echelon of the Communist Party has been deflecting blame of all of China's ills to outside forces. They are trying to use nationalism to create hatred of the outside world and to create a new Yihetuan movement to close China. When you take this into consideration, everything that China has done politically in the last few months makes sense. What seems like mixed signals becomes clear. Sending doctors to other countries is not a sign of good diplomacy for countries where China has completely wrecked relations beyond repair, but a sign to the Chinese people that China has the resources and personnel to deal with the virus. Withholding the US's medication is not a sign of obstinance to a power it cannot afford to upset, but a sign of how China can conduct its own trade policy. Military scats with India on the Arunachal Pradesh is not a declaration of war. No nation has the logistical capability of moving past the Himalayas or even wants to declare war on a nation with nuclear parity. It is a way to yet again increase nationalism. Saying that Italy and the US Army are the sources of the virus is not for some vague geopolitical gain. It's to avert blame from the party and to say something so offensive that the party starts a back and forth argument. And the annexation of Hong Kong is not a way to illogically cut off China's money supply. It is a way to subvert and try to control a rebellion that threatens to spread across China during a time of rapid economic and cultural change. If the CCP could have annexed Hong Kong before, they would have annexed Hong Kong before. To the heads of the party, it is a quagmire that threatens China's stability. Xi Jinping is stalling now because he fears repercussions of a lack of liquidity. But soon, he might fear the repercussions of an unemployed populace. Xi Jinping and the upper tier of the Chinese Communist Party have embarked on a last-ditch effort and are trying to prevent a fracture and hold China together. The main goal is to ensure a transformation of China back into a closed, centralized state that without correct policy would completely fall like it has for millennia. Eventually, Xi will need to impose his will on Hong Kong, regardless of the economic catastrophe it will bring if he wants to stay in power. The tier of the Communist Party that is willing to die for its current system has no other options. With over 20% unemployment, they face the fracturing of the government and the reassertion of another strongman or rebellion from the people. Whether this planned transition will be successful remains dubious, but it is up to the goddess Fortuna. The decisions to act on Hong Kong and the multitude that have come before it is in many ways the march of history, and history has been made apparent again on the banks of the Pearl River Delta.